Hi, good morning. How is everyone? Nice to see you all. So, today we're going to look at the nature of the hero. And we're going to see it in the context of human nature, the topic we've just talked about. And we're going to look at the concept of the hero from a number of different sources. First, what is the hero from the literary perspective? The hero is a type of character that appears in ancient literature and persists up into our own day. Next, what is the trajectory of the development of this concept, and what are the origins of this concept? So what's interesting is, in the ancient world, the hero had a very specific content, meaning something more than just male protagonist who performs heroic deeds. And the origins of this concept don't start in literature, but start in ancient society. And the various functions and attributes of a hero are really on display in Odysseus in his various roles, whether it's warrior or king or head of the household or protector of his people. We see in Greek drama a development of the concept of the hero. So one thing we'll ask is, what do heroes do? What kinds of things do they do? And of course, the basic level, we all have a familiarity with this. Heroes perform great deeds that the ordinary person can't, and do it under extraordinary circumstances, and are celebrated for it. But if you look at the development of the concept of the hero, going from the Homeric tales of the Iliad and the Odyssey to Plato in his central heroic figure of Socrates, you see a clear development of the type of thing that a hero does. Right? So what do heroes do? And we're going to see a trajectory here from Achilles in the Iliad to Odysseus in the Odyssey to Socrates in the Platonic dialogues. Plato called Homer the educator of Hellas, the educator of the Greeks. And the Homeric tales were the Bible for the Greeks, explaining to them the world around them, explaining to them who they were and how they related to that world, explaining what it meant to be a Greek, but also not to be a Greek. And we could think of the hero as the exemplary figure, exemplifying the virtues and the values of Greek civilization. What is the goal of ancient literature? The goal of ancient literature is to be edifying, to be educational, in a moral sense, to show human conduct and help illustrate for us in need of education what is right and what is wrong. Horace said that the goal of literature, we mentioned this at the outset, is to please and instruct. To please and instruct. Right? The pleasure comes in the form of aesthetic beauty, the excitement of the story, the interest of the characters, the aesthetic description of the physical landscape and the empirical world. And the instruction part comes in the form of moral instruction from the point of view of characters providing models of behavior and comportment. And this turns out to be one reason why Xenia is so important, because it illustrates an array of conduct, good and bad, virtuous and noble, and those characters lacking in virtue and nobility. And the goal is to show models to emulate. And the hero clearly is a type of character that we all aspire to emulate, that is a kind of target that's above our own capacities to achieve. Then lastly, connected with the kinds of things heroes do, and we see a transformation in what they do from Achilles to Socrates, is their psychological makeup and what their aspirations and what their goals are. We see a clear transformation in the psychology and aspirations of the hero as we move from Achilles to Odysseus. Okay, so let's begin here. to go back to the opening lines of the poem that establish the significance of human nature, a certain type of man, and a certain type of man that turns out to be hero. The first word of the text in Greek is the Greek word aner, or andra, which comes from the word aner, meaning a certain type of man, not just a male, but a man, a social role, and he's a manly man. And we said that in Greek, the very first word of the text is andra, signifying the centrality and significance of this theme and subject throughout the entirety of the text. You might say that the journey of the Odyssey is really a journey of a certain type of man. What is a manly man, right? A manly man is one who is excellent, virtuous, or heroic. A true individual, someone who is self-assertive, someone who is sure of themselves, confident, ambitious, the kind of person who doesn't take no for an answer. And this is clearly a kind of gender stereotype that they're shaping here. You might even say in our world, this would be toxic masculinity. To show any distinction of the genders is, to illustrate a cultural construct, that's a violation of the equality of democratic society. But for the Greeks, a manly man is really the fulfillment of the male nature, cultural fulfillment, right? And his key virtue, his key excellence, virtue means excellence, is andria, or courage. And it literally means manliness. It is a word derived from the word aner. So therefore, courage is going to be the peculiar virtue, or the central virtue of the hero. Okay, what's a hero? It's the central male character. Let's move ourselves over here. It's a protagonist, an advocate or champion of a particular cause and idea. And we might ask ourselves if Odysseus is somehow the advocate or champion of a particular cause or idea. We might ask what that is, because it seems to be the case that what his goal is simply something very self-interested, something that's connected with his own self-love and his self-interest. And it does not seem like some grand plan or grand campaign to champion a certain cause. But maybe we haven't seen the whole idea there. So clearly, a heroic figure is a person of great ambition. If the goal of a hero is to gain accolades, to gain fame, to gain glory, or the Greek word is kleos, that was the thing Achilles was after, you must be an ambitious person. And to be an ambitious person, you likely have extraordinary talents, but there are talents that come out and are tested under the greatest of circumstances. The Greeks have a concept of agon, A-G-O-N. Agon, it's where you get the word protagonist. Agon is conflict. It's conflict or competition, right? And how is excellence shown? Right? Excellence is shown only under the most extraordinary circumstances in competition. War. What is the greatest human competition you could have? War seems to be the greatest stage. War for the Greeks was the greatest stage where excellence could be truly demonstrated. And you might say, someone may say they're excellent, they may seem excellent, but it is only in the context of war and combat where their mettle is truly tested. These dire crisis type circumstances are the touchstones or the litmus tests that really determine who has the true excellence. So what else is a hero? A hero is a demigod. We've talked about this cosmic hierarchy with the gods at the top, man in the middle, and beasts in nature at the bottom, non-rational beasts in nature. A demigod is somewhere between man and God, right? He's larger than, one way to think it, he's larger than life, right? He's a superhero, right? What's interesting in this, looking at Odysseus as a character who's larger than life, let's look at his actual deeds throughout the entirety of the text. Everything he does is extraordinary by the standards of the ordinary person, but I struggle to find any place in this text where he has specifically kind of almost supernatural powers, right? And much of the text, he is not, this is important, he is not engaged in physical activity, right? Think about when the most daring and heroic feats, physical feats in battle are performed by Odysseus. They are actually performed, if this is a benchmark of the hero, heroic physical feats, they are actually almost all performed, with a few important exceptions, in his recitation beginning in Book 9 to Alcinous of his old adventure from Troy, right? Remember, on the island of Scheria, this is the last location before Odysseus returns home. So he's at his penultimate, which is to say just prior to the last stop on the journey home. And all the great heroic deeds he actually tells about, right? They're narrated, and we've spoken at great length in the beginning of the course about the distinction between plot, the actual facts of what happens, versus how they are recited in a story, right? So we don't really know, and I think this is one of the amusing tropes of this text. We don't really know the relationship between what he tells them and what actually happened, right? Odysseus, at the beginning of him telling his story, is described as Odysseus, great teller of tales. Wow, I mean, to me, someone who is a great teller of tales is a teller of tall tales. They exaggerate, they use hyperbole, they celebrate themselves beyond what actually be the fact. You know, I went out and went fishing this morning, and I came home to my wife, and I said, honey, I caught a fish this big. Right? And we also know that Odysseus is a liar. He's deceptive, and when he gets home to Ithaca, he's actually, when the first time he's going to meet Penelope, his wife, he's going to lie to her repeatedly. And what's so amusing about this text, as a hero and a model of emulation, there are certain modes of conduct that I think we should all find striking that are being celebrated. And I think one of the central ones is deception. He deceives people or beings like Polyphemus, which we find totally acceptable, especially after Polyphemus has grabbed up a bunch of his men and swallowed them or smashed them against the rocks like little puppies, right? That's how it's described in the text. But to lie to his own wife, to lie to people to lie to Alcinous by omission, to not be forthright about who he is, that doesn't seem consistent with our typical notion of a role model, right? And a hero is a form of a role model. Okay, so a classical hero is considered a warrior who lives and dies in the pursuit of honor and glory, and assists their greatness by the brilliance and efficiency with which they kill. This is what the scholar says. Notice what their pursuit is: honor and glory, right? This is not absent in Odysseus. He is a very prideful man who's concerned with recognition. However, his goal is to get home. There's nothing terribly estimable in just wanting to get home and be with his family. However, what's important, I think, is it's tremendously identifiable. We are capable of very strongly identifying with this man because he's not perfect. This is really important. He's not perfect. And his goals are really, in the end, just like everyone else's, the common man's goals, to have security, to have comfort, to be around those you love. Whereas performing heroic feats means the abandonment, typically, of all those things. Notice that a hero is classically defined as a warrior, right? That his deeds are in the specific context of war and combat. So if we look at the word champion, which is closely related to the concept of a hero, you notice a doughty fighting man, a valorous combatant, one who fights on behalf of others and undertakes to defend a cause. So we hear this issue of a cause again. What might be the cause? And the literal meaning, we'll see it in a minute, of hero in ancient Greece, the word means defender or protector. And the question becomes, the defender and protector of what? Pardon me. So the feats of the hero. I think the first thing we think about when we think of the feats of the hero, and here we have two images of Hercules and the centaur and Hercules with the Cretan bull, that their feats are of physical brawn and a certain type of ingenuity, but it's really brute force and brawn and rare physical capacities that defines the hero. Now, Odysseus certainly has these abilities in spades. We know he's a great warrior. He demonstrated this at Troy and also on certain feats on the way home. But it's pretty clear, if you just pay attention to the text, that most of the time Odysseus is on camera, that what he is doing is not physical feats of brawn. In almost all cases, he is using his mind, and he's engaged in speech, very often of one kind or another. Or when he engages in decisive deeds, actions of the body, we notice that a lot of those deeds don't necessarily have to do with physical brawn, but using his wits, using his reason, using his rational foresight, using his judgment. Okay. Nonetheless, Odysseus, Hercules, fulfilled his 12 labors and became a god as a result. These kind of trials that the hero has to go through to achieve glory and everlasting fame. So it's very often talked about with Odysseus that the various situations he encountered constitute his labors to achieve greatness, the labors necessary. And labor is laborious. It's hard work. It's work, and it's also hard. And labor also suggests the concept of pain and suffering, that one's achievement is gained only through pain and suffering. If you look at this list, particularly the lotus eaters, and even to some extent Polyphemus, and with Circe, and the sirens, and Calypso on the island of Ogygia, you notice that many of these feats, if we're going to call them that, are not feats of physical brawn, but feats of the mind, rational restraint. What's the big problem of Odysseus and his men? Why have they not been able to get home? Well, we learn from the prophet Tiresias in Hades that they have failed to curb their desires. They failed to self-restrain, to restrain their own impulses. And what is the classic impulse of the hero? The classic impulse is a spirited impulse of pride, which desires honor and recognition of the highest form. You notice many of these deeds are not at all about achieving greatness, with one exception, and that's on the island of Polyphemus at the end of their time there, where he calls out his name. I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, and so on and so forth. And what happens as the result of his pride and his desire to be recognized? What does he want to say at the end of Book 9 with Polyphemus? Before that he said, stranger, what's your name? Polyphemus says, stranger, what's your name? And Odysseus goes, I'm nobody. I'm nobody. So then when Polyphemus is blinded, and he seeks finally the help of his fellow Cyclopes, he says, nobody did this to me. Nobody took my eye out. And all the other Cyclops says, nobody did this to you? Well, what's the problem? We're going to go on our way. And so Odysseus uses this name nobody to foil Polyphemus. But ultimately at the end of as they're leaving on the ship, he says, I am Odysseus, and I want you to know who did this to you, who harmed you, harmed your eye. And what does that course result in? Two things. Polyphemus picks up this large crag of like the top of a mountain and tosses it at the ship, and it lands just aside the ship, and the wash comes over the ship, and the ship is practically destroyed. And in that instant, all the crew is terrified because Odysseus has been so utterly foolish, and to them it's obvious that he's been foolish. And of course they're right. Later on, they're going to be the ones who are foolish in succumbing to their impulses, and it's going to ultimately lead to their death on the island of Helios with his cattle. But it's the virtue or the characteristic of the hero that precisely the thing that gets Odysseus in trouble. His pride, which is the thing typically celebrated about heroes. And here it's shown in a questioning light. Is this such a good characteristic of a hero. So the hero is a being of superhuman strength and physical courage. We've seen that courage is the virtue which defines the hero. Hero, a demigod, right? Perhaps the original meaning, and this is an etymological dictionary, a defender or a protector, right? And this raises the question of a defender and protector of what? What, for example, is Odysseus a defender and protector of? If a hero protects or defends something, what could it be? Could be a people, right? A family or a kingdom, right? Could be the civilized against the barbarian. So if you think of Odysseus, he's clearly concerned with protecting both his family and his kingdom. He can be seen as defending a way of life through demonstrating courage and ingenuity. He is demonstrating the very attributes and the virtues necessary to perpetuate a way of life. Life is not a static thing. Survival is not guaranteed. The hero is the intrepid figure who takes the courageous steps to win victories where other people are simply less ambitious or too fearful to take those kinds of risks. Clearly, they're a protector of their own life, their own honor, and their own dignity. And for a second, I want to actually look at the origins of this concept. So there is a great book called The City in History, and we'll talk about this more when we look specifically at the structure of the society in the Odyssey. It is the Mycenaean period, about 1300 BC, a very unusual time in Greek civilization, but it was the peak of civilization before the High Classical period of the 5th century. And it's a period that marks a kind of transition between village life and fully urban city life of the later Greek city-state, the polis, the famed polis. So we have village life is defined by tribal relationships and family relationships, and the polis is defined by political relationships in a certain type of government that is explicitly not defined by relationships of blood. Right? This is really important. Odysseus is a father and he's a king, and those two roles are really connected with one another. He's a protector of his own family, but he's also a protector of his own people. And this book makes a very interesting argument that the origins of the hero come out of the hunter, right? In the Paleolithic period, we were hunters and gatherers before we settled down into agrarian life, right? The hunters were the intrepid and skilled, physically skilled men who were willing to risk and go out and try to capture large game that was risk of life and limb, right? While other people stayed in the domestic environment and did other elements in the division of labor. There's only so many people who are willing to take those kind of risks. Well, the interesting question this author, Lewis Mumford, asks is, what happens to the intrepid men once hunter and gatherer society subsides and you have agricultural society, which is the world of the Odyssey? The agricultural revolution is clearly in place. When you get to the later books of the Odyssey, you see the way in which he has a kind of central citadel with a palace, and then in the hinterlands are they're pastoral. There's farmland and there's shepherds grazing in the open land. So with agriculture, however, the dominant food source is, of course, grains, and it's the farmer who is the major producer of food, and the role of the hunter has to go through some type of a transformation. So here's what he says. He says, for the hunter played a useful role in the Neolithic economy. With the mastery of weapons, with his hunting skills, he would protect the village against its most serious, probably its only enemies, the lion, the tiger, the wolf, the alligator. The hunter still knew how to stalk and kill these beasts, whereas the villagers and the farmers probably lacked the weapons and the skill more needed and the audacity needed to do so. Over the centuries, security may have made the villagers passive and timid. So if the village becomes passive and timid because you have other people that they become dependent on, the hero, hunter, right? It means that you only have a greater necessity for these courageous beings. Notice, timidity is the antithesis of courage. So what happens with agrarian society? Where do the hunters go? Well, they become the protectors of the society, still from wild animals, but then from other human beings. They're going to be the makers of war. They're going to be the warriors and soldiers of the society. And they're going to be the warlords of society. And eventually they're going to become the kings. Because if I'm the guy who's protecting you, well, you're going to owe me something in return for performing that really dangerous and daring task. And what you're going to do is you're going to make me king. You're going to put me in control of things, and I will protect you, and you will give me things in return, including status and material well-being. And that seems to be the origin of a king here, is what he's saying. He says, conceivably, the villages protected by the hunter flourished better than those whose crops might be trampled by wild herds, or whose children might be mangled and devoured by marauding beasts. But the very prosperity and peacefulness of the Neolithic village may have caused its protector to exchange the watchdog's role for the wolf's, demanding protection money, so to say, in an increasingly one-sided transaction. So if I'm the military and I'm the one with the force, I get to call the piper gets to call the tune, right? He says the cowed villagers submitted lest the protectors show uglier teeth than animals he offered protection against. So what's the problem when you've got a powerful soldier that they can turn their soldiery, their skills internally on the domestic population, so they're going to be inclined to capitulate. This natural evolution of the hunter into political chieftain probably paved the way for his further ascent to power. Already in the proto-literate moment, Alfred says this, when kingship appeared, the warlord and the law lord became the landlord too. So think about that. The hero starts out as a hunter and then becomes a warlord in terms of them protecting the people through as a soldier and military. And then they become domestically the enforcer of law and the external military against foreign conflict. And then in the political, they become a king. And what does he associate? Next, Mumford speaks of the hunter-hero. He says, traditionally, the hunter-hero's special virtue lay in feats of daring and muscular strength, moving huge boulders, turning the course of rivers, showing contempt for danger and death. In his big and burly person occurs the first general enlargement of dimensions that come with the city. Likewise, the first concentration on physical prowess and mechanical power as ends in themselves. So this is an interesting claim. First of all, he makes the association we made. The hero is about performing great physical feats of daring in the face of dangerous circumstances, the threat of death. And then second of all, of course, originally, all these behaviors serve specific functions to benefit, to protect the village, to protect the city. But notice, then they become valued in and of themselves, feats of daring for their own sake. And I think the hero kind of just able to do spectacular things, like almost like the weightlifter. Now, what's interesting here is this is not Odysseus is not Hercules. I think Hercules is the prime figure that we might think of performing these physical feats of daring. And while Odysseus is capable of them, they're not presented as the central focus of the Odyssey. Now notice this, and this text talks about parts of society. So now very briefly what I'd like to do is just to talk about the cult of the hero in 8th century Greece. Why is the 8th century relevant? The actual story of the Iliad and the Odyssey takes place during the Mycenaean period, during the 13th and 12th centuries BC. So here we're looking at artworks from 400 years later, right? So the Mycenaean period is a major moment in Greek civilization. But the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Homeric tales, actually don't get written down, because they're oral tales, remember. They don't get written down until around the 8th century BC. And what's interesting in the art of this period, number one, you see representations of the Homeric tales all over the place. Iliad, Odyssey, Achilles, Odysseus, and so on. Second of all, their formation socially was very different than the Mycenaean period. In the Mycenaean period, we have warlords living in citadels with hinterlands with some farmers and peasants, and it's like a kind of feudal society. There isn't kind of the proper structures and institutions of government and civilization that we would think of. But by the 8th century, the Greeks have started forming the polis. And what is the polis? It's the Greek city-state with all the sophisticated developments of urban life, of politics, of commerce, and the arts and sciences, the institutions that facilitate and support learning and the mind. And they exhibited a great fascination with this Mycenaean culture that they knew really through the myths. They didn't know it through kind of formal history. And of course, this raised the great question in the modern world. Are these stories based on historical fact in any way, shape, or form, or are they kind of pure myths, right? And really what this seems to be akin to is the way in which in the 20th century, where we experienced a great sophistication and development of society, technologically, socially, in many different ways, society became incredibly complex. We looked back to the Wild West of the 19th century, this period in which all these formations and fixed structures had not come into place, and there was a great degree of freedom. And possibility of shaping the world from the individual's point of view. The first thing you notice about our society as a complex society is you're feeling that the individual is incapable of really making any great change by themselves to it. Society seems to have its own inertia based on its own structures, and individuals just seem to be subordinate to it. So there was this great fascination with the hero. And it's perhaps here where this concept of the hero really becomes more of a literary concept, or a concept of poetry and the arts, rather than an actual figure enforcing justice for people. So here you have this great geometric crater from the 8th century BC, and it depicts this great warrior in two scenes. One here up on top, if you look to the right, on his deathbed, a pyre, where there are women around him mourning for him. Right, he's being celebrated as a great warrior. And then in the lower scene, you see him on a chariot fighting on the battlefield with infantry. Right, so there is this celebration of the warrior type. They're venerated as one of the most significant people within the division of labor and society. And of course, what people celebrate gives an insight into the kind of people they are. Think about us as modern Americans in the 21st century. We've got Hollywood. And Hollywood, I mean, what do you have in Hollywood? You have people who are famous for being famous. You have megastar singers who, if you just put them down in a room and tried to get them to sing without all the fancy technology, they'd sound terrible, right? I mean, Hollywood is a pale image compared to people who have actually performed real achievements. Okay, let's keep going here. All right, so here we see our hero on the battlefield, a chariot. Right, a chariot is actually an indication of very sophisticated society that's engaged in war. And the interesting thing about war is it's not just violence, it's not just conflict. It's two political entities fighting one another in the form of collective and organized violence, right? And that is exactly what you see on display in the Iliad, for example. It's a war, not just a conflict between people. So here we have what's called a kouros sculpture. And a kouros sculpture is a young standing male that celebrates the excellence of the male, and you can see this ongoing obsession with the kind of heroic male type. This strong physique, right, demonstrative of their capacities, and also internally the surface, the image, their build representing something internally, that the only other way you can depict it in a sculpture. Very often these sculptures represented gods like Apollo, and in some cases Achilles, some cases athletes, in some cases warriors, right? All versions of this same kind of archetype of heroic male. This is a sculpture in which we actually know the person's name, and likely they were a fallen soldier, and we know that from the inscription on it, Criosos of Anavasos, and the inscription says this. It says, "Stand and grieve at the tomb of Croesus, whom in the front lines was slain by wild Ares." Right? What happens with Achilles? He dies on the battlefield, and it's a glorious death because he's remembered for all time. And death is a worthy trade-off for being remembered for all times in the eyes of Achilles, right? He was in the front lines. In the front lines of what? In the front lines of battle, of war, and was slain by the wild Ares. Who is Ares? Ares is, of course, the god of war, right? And wild, right? I mean, there's something about the hero in his the psychological and physical makeup that he is the one thrown into this wild, almost crazy circumstance at the extremes of human experience, and is able to weather the slings and arrows of it. Okay. So what are the virtues and excellence of a hero? If a hero is a protector, defender, and a warrior, what are the prime characteristic? What's the prime virtue or excellence they need to have? That excellence is andria, or courage. And we notice that the word courage literally means manliness, right? So therefore a hero is going to be someone who exhibits great bravery. Courage, this is really crucial, turns out to be one of the 4 cardinal virtues in ancient Greek thought. The 4 central moral, cardinal meaning central or most important, moral virtues. Wisdom, which is a type of good judgment based on experience or derived from experience. Moderation, which is temperance or self-restraint. And courage, which literally means manliness. It is the virtue becoming of a male. And then, of course, justice. And this raises the question of, first of all, what is courage? Right? Courage is the ability or willingness to persevere in the face of fear and the threat of death. It's a quality of being able to overcome the fear of death in order to perform a great deed. Right? And of course, it's a rare virtue. Now, we've talked about the 3 parts of the soul. And there is a specific part of the soul associated with courage. And it is thumos, or spiritedness. Spiritedness is that part of the soul which borders on anger, or wrath, or assertiveness. And what does it seek? What does it desire? It's a motivational source that desires honor and recognition. When one performs a courageous deed, one is honored and recognized for it. So thumos has always been associated with courage, the ability to, well, think about it, the ability to overcome irrational thoughts, right? You can say, if I go into this war, rationally speaking, I'm likely to be killed. Or the other one, what epithumia, appetite, what does it desire? It desires creature comfort. It desires survival. So in a spirited person, they actually overcome their rational calculation and their appetite, their desire to live, in order for some moral goal, right? So spirited, we talked about a hero is a protector or defender. Defender, you could say, of moral principles. You could say, with Odysseus, of civilization itself. And it's thumos that commits one to be courageous for the sake of certain principles that in the eyes of others, of the community, you're going to be given respect and honor for having fought for. So we've talked about this. And this raises the question of what virtues and what qualities matter for a hero. And here we have this trajectory of the hero, starting with Achilles and moving to Odysseus and Socrates. Achilles is famous for his wrath, his anger. It's kind of an animal, brute anger. And of course, anger and wrath and pride are all precisely associated with thumos. What is thumos about? I get angry because I want the world to capitulate to my will and to recognize me. Therefore, it's associated with pride. Pride is someone who is concerned with how they are viewed and how their worth is viewed in the eyes of others. Odysseus, on the other hand, very rarely exhibits anger, right? He seems to have a lot of rational control over his anger. And it seems that much more than courage being his central virtue, you might even say moderation becomes closer to his central virtue. What is the goal of the whole text? He must curb his desire in order to get home. Well, what is curb one's desire is just another word for moderation. It's the exact definition that moderation is curbing one's desire. And then he has other elements that seem much more intellectual and associated with things like wisdom, which is to say his cunning, his artfulness, his resourcefulness. All these words get used for him. And notice what he really wants. So those things being associated with logos, reasoning, capacity to reason. But then what does he really desire? He desires to get home. And that desire to get home is, number one, to outwit death and to be in the comfort of a familiar way of life that he wants to return to. And in that sense, he's being driven in many ways by basic bodily appetite, which is to say the drive to survive. Socrates, we'll see, is in many ways not prideful, and one of his core virtues is, at least superficially, a kind of humility. He demonstrates the virtue of wisdom. In fact, most of his life exhibits a fear of death. Odysseus's great heroic feat on the battlefield was leading a retreat in battle. And what do you do when you retreat? It allows you to stay alive. So he's driven in many ways by his fear of death rather than overcoming the fear of death through courageous action. He desired to know and understand. That seems to be the real goal of his life. And he exhibited not physical courage, but intellectual courage in his willingness to question the truisms of his own society, the kind of the accepted opinions of his own society. So if we want to see the difference, we get it very clearly. Achilles was offered this choice: go home and live a long life, or die young and obtain glory forever. Attain glory forever. So we see then that the prime ends of these characters are Achilles' desire for glory and fame, Odysseus' desire to get home and avoid death, Socrates to avoid death and a desire for knowledge. So this marks an important transformation in the virtues and the qualities of the hero. Particularly if you look at the second part here, defining the nature of the heroic deed, we've typically understood the nature of the heroic deed as being manifest in acts of physical brawn, right? But Odysseus, he tells stories, he tells lies, he deceives people, he uses his ingenuity. Ergon means deeds and logos means words or speech, right? And it seems that for Odysseus and Socrates, their heroic feats are performed, their deeds literally consist of speech rather than physical action. So the last thing I want to talk about in terms of Odysseus' character as a hero is to touch on this multifaceted nature, this complexity of this man. He is polytropos. We talked about this word polytropos from the opening lines as generally connected to human nature itself. It's multiple, it's complex, it's complicated, it's convoluted. But Odysseus is in particular a multifaceted being. He has many excellences, and he seems to use the right one in the right circumstance. And this seems to be also associated with a new type of hero, a being who is incredibly adaptable to circumstance because he has so many facets of his own being. He's able to draw on the proper resources in the given moment that demands that have certain abilities. And of course, this is something people normally lack. Everybody's good at something, But to have all the talents to meet all the different circumstances of life is, of course, a great challenge. And Odysseus, in and of himself, is a complex person. This is one of the very problems. This is part of the conflict of the entire epic poem, is that he has many facets to his personality or his soul, and it seems to be exactly why there is maybe even a need for him to go out on this journey and to experience things that satisfy the various parts of his soul. This is connected with the concept of the Homeric epithet. The Homeric epithet. Homeric epithet is simply a descriptive phrase that modifies the name of a person. And number two, it gives an insight into the nature and character of that person. And these descriptive phrases for each character change over time, which acknowledges the multifaceted nature of their identity. And it also acknowledges that different parts of their identity come out under different conditions, under different circumstances. So here are some of the examples. What is a Homeric epithet, right? Descriptive phrase which modifies the name, and it has a specific structure. They can become before your proper name, or they can come after. So the worldly wise Odysseus. It's simply a clause that modifies the proper noun, that gives us greater description or insight into the character, or more specifically, the character at that moment. The epithet that's used is not the same. They are stock epithets, but they are used they are context dependent and specific to what's actually going on in the scene. So it is not random that Homer uses a certain epithet in a certain scene. So who is Odysseus? He's Odysseus, loved of Zeus, son of Laertes, raider of cities? Now wait a second. What kind of hero raids cities? I mean, what is a raider of cities? That's a pirate on land. The man of many twists and turns, the wise Odysseus, the worldly wise Odysseus, master of exploits, the storm-tossed Odysseus, the long in exile, master of craft, the man of craft, of cunning, wily deceitfulness, resourcefulness, man of many resources, the long enduring, the man of pain, the man of many struggles. So notice in all these attributes that there seem to be two primary elements that come out. One, something that's intellectual, a kind of a cunning resourcefulness, an ability to adapt intellectually to a situation and solve the problem. The other is the suffering, right? He seems to be celebrated, in fact, as a man of suffering, not unlike Job, right? There is something heroic in Job for his endurance of suffering. And this is a man who has a virtue, who is capable of suffering a lot and enduring it and coming through at the other end and not being broken by it. This will also be obviously very important in his experience, because what does suffering and experience result in? Ideally, it results in wisdom, again, intellectual virtue. A Homeric epithet suggests that there are various facets of the identity of each character, and Homer chooses to emphasize one of these facets at any given time. The epithet simply reveals the way in which all human beings are polytropos, or multifaceted. The use of a particular epithet is to reveal a certain facet is context dependent. So the epithets that's used relates to the action that's going on in that particular situation. So let's conclude our discussion of Odysseus as a hero with the journey framed as the education of Odysseus. We've made very clear now that this journey is an external one of the body through time and space across the ocean in different directions, but also a journey internally in which the ship is a metaphor for the soul, and the sea is a metaphor for life and its vast possibility, the alternatives, the almost infinite number of alternatives. And the direction one goes is dependent on the motivations within oneself. And what's the problem? We have multiple motivations, multiple desires that pull in antithetical and opposite directions. The strings that are pulling us in contrary ways. right? Reason and the passions being the two dominant kind of forces at work. So Odysseus is this multifaceted person who's trying to find his way. What is home? Home is his soul in the proper order in which he has clarified his own hierarchy of principles and concerns. What is most important to him? What are his priorities? Sometimes it's not so clear. But what has kept him out at sea in general is an inability, this is Tiresias speaking to Odysseus and his men, is inability to curb their wild desires. And of course, it is their recklessness, because they are blind fools, that leads to the demise of everyone in the ship but Odysseus. And it's why Odysseus gets home late, but perhaps not too late. And of course, to curb your wild desires is to self-restrain or self-govern or rule by reason, or it is the virtue of moderation. So the central virtue Odysseus has to achieve as a hero is not courage, but moderation. So there are some examples of their recklessness, which is basically being immoderate, right? Lacking in temperance. And one important concept for the Greeks connected with being immoderate is this concept of pleonexia. Pleonexia literally means like grasping, but implies like this perpetual gush of desires and impulses, one after another, in which we are never satisfied with what we grasp for. And you would think of an orderly life, and an orderly soul would dictate limit to what someone would want based on a priority of an order of rank is what is most important and what is least important. And this journey, this kind of seemingly never-ending journey of him searching out the world, implies just kind of satisfying one desire after another, and every situation brings out a new bit of impulse and curiosity. So what are some of the problems? The men want to stay too long on the island of Ismara, which causes problems for them. Odysseus doesn't listen to his men who tell him to leave the island of Polyphemus. We'll see he wants to stay on that island precisely because he's curious intellectually about the type of beings that live there. Odysseus is rash and succumbs to hubris in taunting Polyphemus, and we've talked about that, the way in which he states his name, and that is his downfall. Then later, as they're making their trip away from Polyphemus' island, Odysseus' men become particularly jealous and envious of Odysseus because, among other things, he's gotten this bag from King Aeolus, and it appears to be some great treasure that Odysseus is not sharing with his men. And what's interesting, they're getting to the point of mutiny, right? They've been on this journey for a while, and they're tired of being on it. On the other hand, Odysseus has been presented as a righteous captain and general to them, and he treats them fairly, and he provides for them. And what's interesting is they start feeling prideful themselves that they haven't been treated with proper respect. And of course, they open the bag, they give in to their desires, and of course it sets their whole journey back in this kind of one step forward, two steps back. Then there's the scene of Elphenor getting drunk on Circe's island, in which he falls asleep on the roof and rolls off the roof and kills himself, and they're unable to give him a proper burial. So obviously one of the most basic bits of recklessness with things like alcohol, and it turns out to lead to his demise. So moderation might be considered one of the crowning elements of civilization, right? Because if animals function on their impulse, civilization is created by the various things that restrain our impulses: laws, moral codes, punishments, pain and suffering, right? You might think of civilization as the distinction between and pause between our instinct and desire and the action or deed on which is its outcome. It's the delta T between desire and its fulfillment, by which I mean the difference in time. You think of physics, delta T is difference in time. So human beings, when they have desires, don't just go off and immediately fulfill them necessarily. There is the rules of society restrain one from doing that, and in doing that, we cultivate an entirely different intellectual and moral attitude that is what civilization is. And what is that? It's the curbing of our desires to prevent the negative outcomes that our desires would lead to. And it raises a fundamental question that there are many desires that are clearly that we harbor, that are clearly both harmful to ourselves and others. What is this delta T all about? It's called education. And we get educated, as Aristotle says in the Ethics, through two means. One through speech and word and persuasion, and the other through deed, through punishment, or what he calls habituation. Right? So if you think about Odysseus' entire journey of suffering, he is being habituated to be shaped to develop restraint if he didn't have it already. And all that restraint leads to wisdom. It forces one to contemplate one's actions more fully. And when we look in the next lecture, we'll look at some examples where Odysseus sits there and we discover that he's contemplating a situation before acting. Okay, we will conclude with this. The hero suffers, and the question is, what is the point of suffering? Part of the suffering he endures is the postponement of the fulfillment of his desire. Odysseus' largest desire is to return home to his family, who he never wanted to leave in the first place. That's really crucial. Forced to leave and wait 20 years to return, and in the process learns to control and moderate himself. And he learns the necessary virtue of moderation in order to displace the suitors and reclaim his place as king of Ithaca. Longing and yearning, right? In Book 5, which I'll read in a moment, he longs and yearns to be home, and that's clearly evident in what's depicted there. And it's the first time we see him as a hero. What is longing? It's an intense desire for something very important that one lacks. But here's the important thing. Yearning is the result of the postponement of the fulfillment of desire. And what does that do to the desire itself? It amplifies it. It makes it into a great, you could say, mental and emotional object, and makes it even more important. The harder it is to achieve, the more important it is, the more value it has when it's actually achieved. So we don't think of a hero longing for something, right? The hero is the being with the capacity to fulfill his desires. He's got those special virtues, those special powers to do things that ordinary people can't do. And yet Odysseus can't do the simplest thing. He cannot get back home. Okay, so this scene on page 155 in Book 6 ties into everything we thought we knew about a hero. Performing heroic deeds, cunning, and how do we finally see? We've talked about this postponement of our desire. We want to see, we came to this movie to see Odysseus in his cameo role on screen. And for the first 4 books, he's been off the screen. He's just been discussed. And it builds up all this anticipation and frames and whets our appetite for what we're going to see. And what is the first thing we see from Odysseus? We see a man who is in tears, longing for home. The very opposite of a manly man. So we finally encounter Odysseus. And the line at line 91 starts, "But as for great Odysseus." And what is this, but as for great Odysseus? But as for all the other characters who are still alive, they've gotten home. But not this one, the one man. Book 1. Hermes could not find him within the cave. So what's the situation? The gods have had their assembly, and Zeus has decided to free Odysseus to come home from Poseidon's wrath. And they're looking on Circe's island to give him the news and let him come home and to tell Circe. And he can't find him, but where is he? We can see him with our camera from the narrator's point of view. Off he sat on a headland, weeping there as always, retching his heart with sobs and groans and anguish, gazing out over the barren sea through blinding tears. Now notice, weeping there as always. And he's on a headlands. It's like he's out on a kind of peninsula out into the sea, and he's looking out over the sea. And this is something he does always. This is This has been his conduct. He's been trapped on this island for about 7 years, right? This is not the conduct of what we would think of as a hero, right? This is the antithesis of it. Retching his heart with sobs and groans and anguish, gazing over the salt-barren sea through the blinding tears, right? What is this crying really about on one hand? It seems to be about the defeat of the hero. The hero has been defeated. When do people cry? First they get angry and they're in denial because they're trying to solve their situation. But they cry when they seem to have the realization that the world will not capitulate to their will. He seems to be an almost broken man. And I think this is very significant. Why is he looking out over the barren sea? What is he looking at? I mean, to be honest, he's looking at nothing but ocean upon ocean. He's looking at a horizon that just fades off over the existence. There's nothing to see. He's looking to see land, right? And in particular, he's looking to see home. Home, because he wants to go home. And this is an instance in which it demonstrates he's longing for home. Think about all the concentrated energies as he's been prevented from going home, all the built-up motivation that cannot be realized. And think about how that's going to be unleashed later on, perhaps on the suitors. It says later, who would willingly roam across a salty waste so vast? I mean, the sea is just endless. It's daunting, so endless. Think, no city of men in sight, and not a soul to offer the gods a sacrifice and burn the fattest victims. But there is no way, you know, for another god to thwart the will of storming Zeus. So Hermes is saying these things, and who would go out on the ocean? Who would go out on the sea? This is a barren wasteland. There is nothing here for mankind, right? There is no city, and that's really important because city signifies civilization and all the trappings that come to it, which make the city, not only is Ithaca the home of Odysseus specifically, but the Greeks understood it that the city was the home of human beings, that human beings belonged in the city because it had all the necessary components of a truly human life, right? And of course, what's mentioned connected with the city of men, you know, highlighting connectedness with other fellow human beings, the camaraderie, the solidarity that comes with that. And then the next thing that's mentioned about the city is no ability to sacrifice to the gods. So religion being central to human identity here. Okay. So in the next lecture, we're going to look at the Homeric encyclopedia, in which we're going to look at the vast array of beings in this world, and also the vast array of human beings in this world, and how they all fit together in a kind of a puzzle. Thank you.